If you watched our previous video on the Central United Methodist Church, founded in 1899 as the first organized Protestant congregation in the Philippines, you already know the name Nicolas Zamora. He was the young Filipino preacher from Tondo who stepped forward when no interpreter showed up, delivered a sermon that stopped the room, and became the first Filipino ordained Protestant minister. That story is where this story begins. Because 10 years later, that same man would do something even more dramatic. He would walk out. February 21, 1909. A Sunday morning in Tondo, Manila. The district is one of the oldest and most densely packed in the city. Its streets carry the smell of the sea and the noise of the market. It is the kind of place where ordinary people live, fishermen and families squeezed into narrow houses along the waterfront. It is not the Manila of the elite. It is the Manila of the people. And in St. Paul's Church in Tondo, a Filipino pastor named Nicolas Zamora stands in the pulpit before his congregation. He has preached here hundreds of times. He has baptized their children and buried their dead. They know his voice. They trust him. But today he is not preaching a sermon. Today he is making an announcement. He tells them he is leaving the Methodist Episcopal Church, that he loves the doctrines and will keep the faith, but that he can no longer serve under a system where Filipinos are treated as second-class citizens in their own country and in their own church. That God has called him to build something new, something Filipino. The room erupts. Filipino lay workers rise one by one and turn in their ministerial licenses on the spot. They are going with him. 7 days later, on February 28, 1909, a new church is born, the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista en las Islas Filipinas, the first indigenous evangelical denomination in the history of the Philippines. This is that story. To understand why Nicolas Zamora did what he did in 1909, you have to understand the air that Filipinos were breathing in the first decade of the 20th century. The revolution against Spain had only just ended. The Philippine-American War, which cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives, had concluded in 1902, officially at least, though resistance continued for years. The wounds of colonial rule were raw. The hunger for self-determination was not an abstract political idea. It was personal. It ran in the blood of every Filipino who had watched their parents defer to foreign authority their entire lives. The Americans introduced religious freedom when they arrived. Protestant missions came and were welcomed in many quarters, not just as a spiritual alternative to the Spanish Catholic system, but as carriers of education and a new democratic possibility. The Methodist Episcopal Church had found real traction, especially in Manila, where Nicolas Zamora had helped build a thriving congregation in the working-class heart of Tondo. But there was a fault line running underneath all of it. The Methodist Episcopal Church in the Philippines was structured, in practice, as an American institution with Filipino workers. District superintendents were Americans. Missionaries in charge directed the activities of Filipino ministers. The top of the hierarchy was foreign, and no matter how gifted or effective a Filipino pastor was, the ceiling above him was low. For many Filipino believers, this was simply a new version of the old colonial arrangement, a different language, a different collar, the same power structure. A secret society of Filipino Methodist workers called Ang Kapisanang Katotohanan, which means the Fellowship of Truth, had been formed and twice revived to advocate for Filipino leadership. Their demand was simple: treat the Philippine Church as a foreign field with genuine autonomy, not as a domestic extension of the American Church. In 1908, the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church rejected that demand outright. That rejection was the last straw for Nicolas Zamora. Nicolas Zamora was born on September 10, 1875, in Binondo, Manila. His family name carried extraordinary weight. His great-uncle Jacinto Zamora was one of the 3 Filipino priests executed by the Spanish in 1872 in the Gomburza martyrdom, one of the most galvanizing events in Philippine nationalist history. The name Zamora in Filipino consciousness was already a name associated with courage and the refusal to be silenced by colonial power. Nicolas came of age in the early years of the American period, and through a series of encounters became one of the first Filipino members of the new Methodist congregation in Manila. We have already told part of his story in our previous video. How he stepped forward to preach in 1899 when no interpreter appeared. How Bishop Thoburn was so moved that he arranged for his ordination as the first Filipino Protestant minister in the nation. In the years that followed, Zamora became one of the most gifted evangelists the Methodist mission had ever produced. In 1906 alone, he preached nearly 75 times in more than 25 locations across and beyond Manila. He was tireless and magnetic. He spoke the language of ordinary Filipinos, literally and spiritually. People followed him, and yet, even as he served faithfully, the restlessness grew. He watched American missionaries occupy positions of authority that he and his Filipino colleagues were systematically denied. He watched the 1908 General Conference close the door on Filipino autonomy, and he began to ask the question that, once asked, could not be unasked. Why should Filipinos need American permission to lead their own church in their own nation? He was not anti-American in spirit. He had learned the gospel through American missionaries. He cherished Methodist doctrine and would carry it into his new church intact. But he was Filipino in a moment when being Filipino meant something fierce and non-negotiable. And so he chose. On February 20, 1909, the night before his public announcement, Zamora met with the members of Ang Kapisanang Katotohanan at the house of Moises Buzon in Tondo. They planned, they prayed, and the next morning he walked into his pulpit and changed Philippine church history. The fallout from Zamora's February 21 announcement was immediate and electric. Within days, 3 ordained Filipino ministers had withdrawn from the Methodist Episcopal Church alongside him. 25 full-time evangelistic workers, about a fourth of the entire Methodist mission workforce in the Philippines, followed, and 1,500 church members and probationers, representing a significant portion of the Methodist congregation in Manila and surrounding provinces, came with them. The Tondo Church alone lost most of its membership. Out of 669 registered members in 1909, only 80 remained with the Methodist Episcopal Church. The rest followed Zamora. On February 28, 1909, the new church was formally constituted. Its founding declaration was extraordinary in its clarity and conviction. It stated, "It is ordained of God that in the Philippines, the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista en las Islas Filipinas be established, which shall be run by Filipinos, and where the gospel shall be preached in the languages of the Philippines. Run by Filipinos, in the languages of the Philippines." Those two commitments to Filipino leadership and to vernacular preaching were not just organizational preferences. They were a theological statement that God speaks Filipino, that the gospel does not require a foreign intermediary, that the church belongs to its people. The IEMELIF was structured from the start as a self-governing, self-sustaining, and self-propagating church. These were not aspirations for the distant future. They were founding principles enacted from day one. Nicolas Zamora served as its first general superintendent. He had only 5 years left to live. He would use every one of them. In 1909 alone, the very year the church was founded, Zamora and his colleagues planted congregations across an extraordinary geographic spread. Zamora himself pioneered churches in Bataan, Nueva Ecija, and Rizal. Reverend Alejandro Reyes began the Bulacan congregation. Reverend Victoriano Mariano opened the Laguna congregation. By 1910, Reyes and Mariano had pushed further into Tayabas, now known as Quezon Province. By 1911, churches were growing in Pangasinan and Cavite. By 1914, Batangas and Pampanga had been reached. This was not slow, careful institutional growth. This was an eruption. Ordinary Filipino preachers moving through the provinces, preaching in Tagalog, in Ilocano, in Kapampangan, in the languages people actually dreamed in. This was the IEMELIF's founding promise made flesh, the gospel in the languages of the Philippines, carried by Filipinos to Filipinos. Zamora himself served as an itinerant evangelist during these years, preaching, planting, traveling constantly. He was building a national church almost single-handedly in its early years, while also managing its organizational structure and navigating a new denominational identity. Then, on September 14, 1914, Nicolas Zamora died in Bulacan. He was 39 years old. His successors carried what he started. Reverend Alejandro Reyes became the second general superintendent. Under Bishop Gregorio Brillantes, the church formulated its own discipline, distinct from the Methodist Episcopal model it had borrowed. And in 1929, 20 years after the founding, the first central temple was erected in Tondo, Manila, on a site that would carry IEMELIF history through triumph and tragedy alike. When the Japanese Imperial Army occupied the Philippines in 1942, they faced a problem that had nothing to do with military logistics. They faced the Filipino church, and they had a solution: consolidation. All Protestant churches in the Philippines were to be merged into a single entity controlled by the occupying government. For the IEMELIF, this was not just a threat to organizational independence. It was a direct assault on the very principle that had brought the church into existence, the principle that Filipino Christians have the right to govern themselves. Bishop Matias Valdez, General Superintendent from 1939 to 1947, stood firm alongside Bishop Dionisio. They refused to surrender the IEMELIF's independence into the Japanese-mandated merger. Meanwhile, the central temple in Tondo, completed in 1929, and the physical heart of the IEMELIF, was destroyed by fire in 1941 as the war was beginning. The congregation lost its cathedral, they lost their building, but they did not lose their church. When liberation came in 1945, the IEMELIF emerged intact as an independent denomination. The Japanese occupation had failed to absorb it. The fire had failed to extinguish it. The church that Nicolas Zamora built on the conviction that Filipino believers could govern themselves had survived one of the most catastrophic tests imaginable. Today, the IEMELIF is recognized officially as the first Indigenous Evangelical Protestant denomination in the Philippines. That is not a ceremonial title, it is a historical fact with enormous implications, because the IEMELIF proved, in 1909, that Filipino Christians could build, lead, and sustain a church entirely on their own. That proof changed the landscape of Philippine Christianity. Nicolas Zamora has been called, across different eras and different sources, the Martin Luther of the Philippines, the John Wesley of the Philippines, and the foremost leader of religious liberty in the Philippines. On October 18, 1980, Sanday Street in Tondo was renamed Nicolas Zamora Street in his honor, a quiet street in the heart of the neighborhood where he stood up and said, "Enough." The IEMELIF Bible College, founded formally in 1947, has trained generations of Filipino pastors and church workers. The church today has congregations not just across every region of the Philippines, but in the United States and in other parts of the world. A Filipino church planted by Filipinos, now carrying its message beyond Philippine shores. The IEMELIF maintains membership in the National Council of Churches in the Philippines and the World Methodist Council. Its current general superintendent is Bishop Noel M. Abiog, carrying forward a line of Filipino leadership that has never been interrupted since 1909, and the central temple in Tondo still stands, rebuilt and enduring, in the neighborhood where it all began. Right where Nicolas Zamora preached his last sermon to the Methodist Episcopal Church and walked out to build something new. Acts 17:26 in the ESV says that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the times and boundaries of their habitation. God determines the times and the places. He placed Nicolas Zamora in Tondo, Manila in 1909, at the exact moment when Filipino nationalism and Protestant Christianity met. And he used that meeting to plant the first indigenous evangelical church in a nation of over 7,000 islands. That was not an accident. That was providence. The IEMELIF was born from the conviction that God speaks every language, hears every people, and does not require a colonial power structure to do his work. That conviction is as true today as it was on February 28, 1909, and it is a word that the global church in every nation and in every era still needs to hear. God builds his church through his people, not despite them, through them. If this video added something to your faith, your thinking, or your understanding of God's work, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps this content reach more believers who need to hear it. And if someone in your life needs to see this, share it. That means more than any algorithm ever could. This channel exists to take the Word of God and the story of His work. No fluff, just faithful, honest, biblically grounded content. We are glad you are here. Stay with us. God bless you.